Okay, now it's 2 minutes past 5 p.m. UK time, and maybe good morning, good afternoon, or good midnight, ladies and gentlemen from different time zones. Welcome to Pylontech and BloombergNEF's webinar, Scaling the Residential Energy Storage Market. I am Sean from Pylontech's marketing team, and I will be the moderator today. So please allow me to introduce the host, Winnie Wei. She's our Chief Strategy Officer of Pylontech US, and she will make a brief introduction about Pylontech, about the white paper, and why we jointly released the white paper with BloombergNEF. Then we will have Nelson, energy storage associate from BloombergNEF, to interpret the white paper for us. So we will also have a Q&A session after that. So now I will hand over the mic to Winnie. Winnie, please.
Thank you, Sean. Let me share my screen. Again, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Winnie Wei. I am the Chief Strategy Officer at Pylontech US. And today I'll be spending 15 minutes just to highlight a few charts of this white paper, and Nelson and Situm, the energy storage associate from BloombergNEF, will take a deeper dive into the white papers for about 30 minutes. So on November 27th, Pylontech and BloombergNEF jointly released a residential energy storage white paper at the BloombergNEF summit in Shanghai. The world has witnessed a rapid market and industry growth of energy storage in the past few years. However, there are unresolved issues regarding the choice of products, the value chain of the industry, as well as policies and business models that would enable residential battery owners to capture the value of the grid flexibility. Pylontech, as a leader in the residential energy storage industry, utilized our long-term experience, strengthened with BloombergNEF's macro perspective and well-developed methodologies, hope to contribute to the residential energy storage market. As the whole world is experiencing an era of transition, specifically shifting from fossil-based systems of energy production and consumption to renewable energy sources, this chart on the left models an outlook to take the world to net zero emissions by 2050. If the prediction carries true until 2050, then the pink section, which is the battery backup, would require 2.8 terawatt hour to be installed by 2050. And our current year is at the midpoint on the x-axis. And you can see the 2020s are pretty much when the energy landscape will start to change drastically going forward. The reason we say that energy storage is a key component to net zero is because residential batteries will enable a fully electrified future for all. At the household level, the battery charges during daytime with extra generated solar power and discharge at night when there is higher demand. Residential batteries provide economic and social benefits to users. For instance, on the far right, you can see in the red boxes, benefits include lower bills, cost certainty and stability, strengthening the resilience of households, and reliability. With storage systems, users don't have to change their behaviors. They just simply apply time of use or other applications to flexibly adopt the distributed energy resources. Residential batteries also provide essential service to the grid. Words in yellow, green, and blue boxes are advantages of backup batteries that brings to the grid. Beyond the immediate benefit of economy and the grid, the communities benefit from residential batteries through overall reduction of emissions, improve community resilience and reliability. From a macro commercial perspective, in the United States, the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, has been adding many programs to the incentive landscape. And nowadays, we see more and more local utilities and local policies incentivizing battery-only programs. There are many benefits of energy transition, but we can't do it alone. It takes a vast network to adopt net zero. Pylontech is a unique vertical integrator. We position to support, to provide cells, modules, and BMS, and that is how we bring value to the global cooperation. We have partners around the world with long-standing history, who provide software and local services. Battery manufacturers like us value these global partnerships. We're founded in 2009. We have delivered more than 1 million energy storage system to over 80 countries for over 10 years. We are the first energy storage focused company on the Chinese stock exchange. As I have mentioned before, Pylontech has full control of our supply chain with the ability of vertically integration. We manufacture cells, modules, BMS, and system integration all under one roof. Pylontech's global footprint is expanding. We have 4 manufacturing facilities in China and 1 in Italy, and the total production capacity is 17 gigawatt hours. And we have overseas branches throughout Europe and the United States. We are also setting up branches in Japan and Australia. And that includes my presentation, and now I will hand over to Nelson.
Thank you, Winnie. I'll share my screen and begin in a second. So just to follow up and also give a brief introduction on BNEF and what we do and why we partnered with Pylontech in this report. I'll have a brief slide and then get into the contents from the report directly. So just to go over what we do at BNEF, we provide research covering the whole energy transition. So you'll see on this slide, we have 3 broad categories that we look at, from commodities, different sector teams, and then we think about cross-cutting technologies, and then finally we think about sustainability and how that moves, and how we can think of technologies around and recycling and sustainability of different technologies. So for the sector transitions, we, the energy storage team, focus, of course, on clean power, solar, wind, storage. And what we've done for a long time is look at the cost of different technologies and then model how much we think will be built in different net zero or energy or economic transition scenarios. So this is a very sort of bottom-up view that we have, and we kind of sort of top-down view that we have, looking at different costs of technologies. But what we found and increasingly find is that there are some technologies and some sectors where there is a consumer element, and residential storage and solar, of course, is one of that, where we decided to do more research to understand what motivates consumers, what's the missing link between economics-driven uptake and uptake for other reasons. And there are some interesting findings that we'll share and discuss through this webinar and through this report. If you do have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat or wait till the end, where we'll be taking some time to do a Q&A. So I'll jump straight into the contents of the report, starting, of course, with demand. So we'll go through, first of all, the demand we see for residential storage, important findings that we saw thinking about demand for residential storage globally. Then we'll be talking about residential storage technologies and products, how that's evolving, the major changes we see, and what consumers actually are aware of and think about in that sense. like I said, it's a consumer-facing, it's a sort of a business-to-consumer technology and product, and a lot of the thinking has to be aware and aligned with what's necessary to scale a market that's consumer-facing. We'll be talking about flexibility and how residential batteries can provide flexibility to the power system, what the barriers are, and how to overcome that. And we'll be ending with some major takeaways from the report. So starting with demand, the first thing to say is that today residential battery systems are primarily being sold in 5 key markets. Germany is still the largest market. The United States, Italy, Austria, and Japan are the next largest markets. Combined, they account for over 80% of installations globally, and that we expect that will continue to be the case out to 2030. Germany, as you'll see on the chart in yellow, is the biggest market by quite a distance. And what's really driven the market in Germany is long standing subsidies introduced initially by the German Development Bank, KfW, in 2013. And those subsidies have helped push the market to a point where now the most common option for a customer installing residential solar is to include a battery alongside that. And we'll see in the next slide the different attachment rates across markets. And you see that Germany, over 76% of residential solar systems installed in 2023 came with a battery. The only market that comes close to that is Italy, where over 70% of systems came with a battery. But the situation in Italy and in Germany is very different. For example, in Germany, you have a subsidy program that's been working for over a decade. It's been scaled down massively now. Not many subsidies available at a national level, but you still have some regions offering subsidies. But really what it is that the subsidy was stepped down slowly, and in a way that now, even though it's been removed in lots of markets, you still have people attaching batteries with solar. So the penetration amongst installers is really high. Most installers in Germany, of course, will also be offering residential battery systems. Italy just below, completely different market, where a subsidy program was announced in 2020. And that subsidy program was pretty generous, offering 110% of the cost of a residential energy installation would be reimbursed by the government through a tax rebate that could be claimed over 5 years. And what that meant is that lots of people decided to install not just solar and batteries, but also heat pumps and other home energy upgrades. But that scheme was too generous, and unlike in Germany, where the scheme lasted over 10 years, this one has been wound down a lot in the past year, and that's led to a big decline in the market that we'll show in the next slide. And the other markets shown here, across Europe, you see that the average is just above 25–30%. Again, that's pushed up by Germany and Italy, but you have markets across Europe like the UK, Switzerland, Austria, and Belgium, where attachment rates are all above 30%, compared to in markets like Australia and the US, where the average attachment rate is between 15 and 20%. In the US, the kind of major market there that we've seen is Hawaii, where there's sort of mandates for people installing rooftop solars to install batteries. So the attachment rate is well over 90%. But in most markets, and especially California, the largest market, it's just above 12%. And across the board, attachment rates are relatively low in the US. We'll get into why get into more of why later. But the main reason, again, is because first in Germany and Italy and parts of Europe, residential batteries have been subsidized by governments. But the second reason, which we'll go into, is the existence of export tariffs. So in lots of these markets, US and Australia specifically, you have really generous export tariffs for solar. So if you install a solar panel in your home, you can export the excess solar to the grid, receive a feed-in tariff, and it discourages people from buying batteries. That's starting to change, and we'll get into that a bit later. Finally, just to close on Italy, because I think there's an important narrative here on demand, and this is also important to battery manufacturers, to industry as well. So in Italy, like I said, there was a policy introduced in 2020, close to the end of 2020, that reimbursed anyone installing a residential battery or a residential energy system. So if you're installing solar or a battery or a heat pump, you would get the full expense covered by the government. You claim it back through your tax returns over 5 years. So that's an extremely generous scheme. Essentially means that you can install these systems for free. But what happened was that scheme was, of course, as it sounds, too generous. and the government went into a big deficit, and that has been rolled back. So at the moment, those tax credits are not transferable by anyone who holds them, and that's led to a big decline in the market. So the chart here is showing quarterly new residential battery additions in Italy from the first quarter of 2021 to the second quarter of 2023. And you see that we had the first quarter-on-quarter decline in 2Q 2023 after the scheme was suspended in February 2023. Again, that's led to a lot of projections we had and the industry had for residential battery installations in 2023 were extremely high. The assumption was that growth would continue at the rate that we'd seen in 2022, of course, assuming that that subsidy would continue to have an impact. But it was scaled back very quickly. Lots of disappointments in terms of demand not being where it should be. And that means, of course, if you're a battery manufacturer or installer and you've invested heavily in inventory, we have lots of narratives of products stuck in inventory and demand being much lower than expected. So from a policy perspective, there, I think for us, two key takeaways here. The first is when introducing a subsidy scheme to think about how it's sustainable and whether it's sustainable and when to scale it down. And that usually is done over a number of years. And in the case of Italy, it was a situation where an ambitious government made a scheme that was too generous and then the next one took it away. That has an impact not just on battery manufacturers and storage providers who invest heavily in inventory and try and invest in sort of growing that market, but also in this case, it impacted consumers as well, who were left with lots of stranded and half-finished investments. I'll move on to the next section, talking about the technology and the product and what we've seen in the last few years for residential battery systems. So this table here is showing the battery chemistry used for major projects by residential storage providers, starting with 2017, what was offered then, 2021, and 2023. Starting with 2017, you'll see that lots of products were almost evenly split between using LFP systems and NMC, LFP battery chemistries and NMC or NCA battery chemistries. So LFP, which refers to lithium iron phosphate batteries, are batteries used in 2017, as you'll see here, primarily by Chinese battery manufacturers and storage providers. Again, it's a technology pioneered by and dominated by Chinese manufacturers versus NMC batteries, which were primarily offered by South Korean battery manufacturers like LG and also American storage providers using some of those systems like Tesla. So you'll see that switch over time has gone from primarily kind of being a 50-50 split between lithium iron phosphate batteries and nickel manganese cobalt batteries to one that's being in 2023 almost sort of dominated by LFP. So you'll see in green the major manufacturers from Japan and South Korea and also sort of American providers like Tesla moving towards using and offering LFP batteries for their residential storage system products. There are a few things that go into that, which we'll touch on the next slide. There are three major benefits for using LFP batteries for residential storage systems relative to sort of most common alternatives today. The first is safety. So in this chart here, you'll see the green outline represents LFP batteries. And you'll see that, and we can compare here the performance of LFP batteries relative to NMC batteries on these 5 key metrics. The most important ones here that we'll talk about for residential storage systems are safety, cycle life, and cost. So starting with safety, you'll see that LFP batteries outperform on safety relative to NMC batteries. And that's been a big conversation in some markets where there have been instances of battery fires in Germany, Austria, and Australia. You would have seen in the news over the past year. Lots of instances and news reports of battery fires and explosions of residential batteries in people's homes. And for the residential segment especially, that's a big concern. We'll touch on that in the next slide, on how much consumers are thinking about this at the moment. But with more and more of these situations occurring, it can become an even bigger topic. And we've seen manufacturers and installers and storage providers start to make a shift towards prioritizing using LFP batteries for improved safety. But the second thing, and maybe more important thing to think about now is cost. So there's a big cost benefit for using LFP batteries over NMC batteries. And for the residential market, where uptake of residential batteries has been relatively slow because of the higher system costs, LFP batteries outperform in terms of cost, owing to the fact that they're using raw materials like iron and phosphorus, which are much cheaper and much more readily available than nickel and cobalt used in NMC batteries. The final thing is cycle life. Of course, with LFP batteries, you can get a much higher cycle life than NMC batteries, which means you can offer systems that potentially last for longer and can be cycled for longer and cycled more heavily and aggressively. In the aspect where you see NMC batteries outperform LFP batteries, energy density, what we find is that for the stationary storage segment, so both for batteries that are being installed in people's homes and batteries that are being used for grid scale projects, that's less of a concern than batteries being used in electric vehicles. So for an electric vehicle, you want an energy dense battery because you want to pack the same amount of energy in a smaller weight, and then you can get more range on the electric vehicle, and you can have potentially faster electric vehicles as well. For the stationary segment and for home batteries, that's much less of a concern. And we see that even though NMC batteries outperform in that metric, it's not as much of a competitive advantage in the residential storage segment. And moving on to what, how that connects to BloombergNEF survey that we carried out for this report. We surveyed installers in Germany, Italy, the UK, and Canada to discuss and find out what they found consumers actually inquired about and what they asked about when making requests for residential battery products. Surprisingly, one thing we found was that consumers make very few requests and know very little about battery chemistries and what kind of chemistries are going into the products they're installing. Typically, a consumer would go to an installer, request different products, and then sort of base their decisions mainly on things like pricing and things like the size of the system. So other metrics that we thought and we find, of course, to be important as part of industry, like battery chemistry, are not something that is well known by consumers. We did find that there is a small proportion of consumers that would make a purchase of an LFP battery because it's cobalt free and because of that kind of marketing. But overall, installers just decided that they thought that was a small proportion of consumers. For consumers, what's more important that we find is features like the sizing of the system, the modularity of the system, and that's the ability to increase or reduce the size of the system depending on how their energy consumption changes, was one thing that was flagged to be important. The second takeaway here from this chart is to say that for different types of consumers, different things, these different factors were rated very differently. So for consumers that were focused on bill savings, so focused on just reducing the amount of money that they were spending on their electricity consumption, of course, economics and the payback period was one of the most important things when going to an installer. The second thing was modularity and the ability to increase the system size depending on their need. But for consumers who were focused on increasing their solar self-supply, so these are maybe more green-minded consumers who don't necessarily want or are not worried about their bills. They were more interested in the sizing of the system, but other things like smart features and outdoor ratings. So less focused on economics and less focused on how much the system costs or the payback period. So this is a group of customers that would be willing to install a battery, even if it was not necessarily going to reduce their energy bill in the short term. And then the third type of customer that we discussed about with installers were consumers focused on having backup power. So these are consumers that are either in a location like Florida or California, where there are natural weather events that lead to a lot of outages, or they're in markets where They do not have access to 24/7 electricity or reliable grid electricity. And for them, the two most important things were, of course, the size of the system to make sure that they have enough energy to use in the event of an outage. So the size of the battery system, and then the ability to have off-grid and functionality included in the installation from the start. So a big takeaway again for us here was the focus in terms of marketing of residential storage system products may not always align with actually what consumers are thinking about. And the effort here that we concluded as a recommendation for both industry and installers was to have a stronger alignment between understanding what the consumer wants and understanding what the installer is marketing to the consumer. Because for the consumer, their main point of reference, even though, considering that they don't understand these products all the time, is the installer. So putting more effort and actually the battery manufacturers and installers building a relationship and having a greater understanding of the products and trying to fit that to what consumers need in each market. Moving on to a section on flexibility. One thing that we considered as part of this report was residential batteries, like we said, like Winnie mentioned in the introduction, have the potential to help smoothen the energy transition. So we have the potential for a lot of rooftop solar coming in different markets. And with that increase in rooftop solar, we should start to see a duck curve form in different markets. We'll show shortly what that looks like and what that means. But a big challenge so far has been residential customers that install batteries do not always receive the value from the grid or from the grid operator, from the system operator, or from their utility. They do not often receive the value that they're providing back to them. So there needs to be a more concentrated effort in making sure that residential consumers are rewarded for providing flexibility, and that's what this section covered. So there are two ways that residential batteries can provide flexibility. First of all, you can have the customer who is using the battery to reduce their own bill, not thinking about the grid, just thinking about making sure they're maximizing their solar consumption, and this can have a secondary effect on the grid. And the second is market-driven, where you actually have to aggregate residential batteries through a third party and participate them in different markets. So just on the market-driven approach, this is what that looks like. So you have either at the household level or at a system level, you have a period in the day between 6 a.m. and the evening where solar generation is really high. And when solar generation is really high, you have really low power prices. And for the homeowner, what you can do at that point is to charge your battery, of course. When demand is low and solar generation is high, you see all of that excess solar can be met by the battery can charge with all that excess solar, and then discharge later in the evening when the sun goes down, but you have demand coming from air conditioning or cooking and heating demand, increasing demand, and of course increasing power prices, creating an opportunity for batteries to charge. So when batteries do that at the household level, that helps smoothen this curve in blue, this power price curve in blue, by pushing up demand during the solar hours and pushing down demand on the grid during the evening time. So that helps reduce power price volatility also at the system level. The second benefit, like I said, from residential batteries being used at a household level is reducing also the strain on the physical wires and distribution grids. So you have here in Hawaii, for example, which is a good example where you have really, really high penetration of solar. And what this charts are showing is the percentage of time where the distribution feeders in these markets have bidirectional load. So increasingly now you have a situation where you have distribution feeders which were not built to do that, sending electricity both ways, because lots of consumers are sending electricity from their solar plants back into the grid in areas where the distribution feeders were only built to send electricity directly to the homes. So residential batteries, of course, can help, because instead of having consumers send excess solar back to the grid, that solar can be stored in a battery and used on site in the home and reduce the strain on the local grid. The challenge then is, where are residential batteries allowed to participate in energy markets? So we just went through kind of the sort of customer-driven approach, where residential batteries help the improve flexibility of the home and have a secondary impact on the grid. But now we're looking at where residential batteries are allowed to be aggregated and provide services to the wider power system. That's still evolving. In a lot of markets today, you do have the opportunity to provide frequency response services, for example, in the UK or Australia or Belgium. But what's happening is that actually there's a lot of difficulty getting those batteries to be aggregated and provide those services. And in many cases, we find that it's not yet fully profitable for residential batteries to be able to do this. So in Australia, you see that, for example, you have the opportunity to provide a whole range of different combinations. And for the customer, there is an additional extra benefit for providing more services. So on the right, you'll see a reposit offering where the consumer's battery will be used to provide wholesale energy services, frequency response services, and also grid support services. And of course, on the left, you see a battery only providing wholesale trading. The challenge here is that what we found from some of these examples is that the increased usage on the consumer's battery doesn't match the additional annual benefit. So there's a lot of work to do between the utilities, the aggregators, and the grid operators, and ensuring that actually the benefit to the consumer actually is representative, and consumers do have an actual incentive to allow their batteries to be used to be aggregated. In the UK, we have what we call local flexibility markets, which we think are a more attractive market for residential batteries, because typically you have a location-specific need. So, a grid operator, instead of upgrading a wire in a very specific location, can use a residential battery in that specific location. And we've seen that opportunity starting to grow, and some residential batteries being contracted. The challenge, again, is that there is a shortfall in terms of the amount that residential battery owners are paid to provide these services. And that's shown in the chart on the right, where you see the missing revenues that still are there for the residential battery to achieve a 10-year payback. So what next? I think, the key takeaways for us thinking about what it's useful for industry to think about when thinking about scaling the market. We have three things here. The first thing is that residential battery prices are falling, and they're falling faster than solar. So this is showing the cost of residential PV and storage systems in Germany from 2017 to 2022. And you'll see that, of course, batteries are, of course, at a different stage relative to solar, which is a much more mature technology. And even with the bump that we saw in system, in sort of battery pack and cell prices in 2022, this chart is showing you the price of storage systems, residential storage systems sold in Germany. And these are systems between 10 kilowatt hours and 30 kilowatt hours versus systems between 10 and 20 sold in PV systems sold in Germany in that same year. So you see residential battery prices are falling much quicker. And there's still a lot of room for prices to come down. For context, you have a battery rack price, which is roughly around $150 per kilowatt hour, relative to a storage system price close to $1,000 per kilowatt hour. So there's a lot of room to grow. There's a lot of room for prices to come down. And we think prices will continue to come down faster than they are for solar. And that creates opportunities and increases the economic benefit of installing a residential battery. The second thing to watch is cost-reflective rate structures. So like I said, you have a situation today where consumers are either paid a lot of money to export their excess solar back to the grid, but over time, what we see is that that's causing a lot of strain on local grids. And we're starting to see regulators decide to change those structures. So California was a good example, where NEM 3.0, the Net Energy Metering Plan 3.0, was proposed. And as soon as that kicks in, what happens is that you see that the payback period of solar plus storage becomes much shorter than the payback period of the solar installation only. So it becomes much more economically viable to install a battery and a solar system rather than install solar alone. And that's because the new rate structure now takes into account the fact that sending solar back to the grid increases stress on the distribution grid, and then includes the appropriate charges for that. We see something similar in Netherlands, where there's a plan to now scale down the net metering scheme. So the scheme has been paying consumers the retail electricity price for all this excess solar that they export back to the grid. And that's going to be drastically cut by around 9% each year until 2030, where it falls to zero. And again, this is going to increase, of course, the attractiveness of installing a battery relative to installing just solar alone. And finally, like Winnie began with, I'll close on this slide showing the importance of cooperation between different companies globally. The final thing to conclude on with the residential segment is that there are lots of different players and it's a highly distributed market. And what we find is that it's very difficult for one manufacturer to expand and cover the entire value chain in every new market that it wants to expand into. So expanding into a new market requires expertise, not just in hardware manufacturing, but software and energy management systems, system integration, and then energy trading as well. There is a lot of difference between each market in terms of how the market functions, what the different services are, and even the energy management systems that are useful for that market. And what we've seen actually is that global corporations have started to form around companies building and doubling down on their expertise in cell manufacturing and module manufacturing, and the development of battery management systems, and then partnering or working with local companies that have expertise in developing energy management systems or have relationships with installers or experience energy trading and forming VPPs. So this is how we see the market scaling, and we think this is an important part of how this segment is going to continue to grow. So I'll pause here, and we're happy to take questions. I think we see some in the chat already, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Nelson, for your insightful sharing. Sean, do you see any questions in the Q&A?
Currently, no.
Nelson, do you see any questions in the Q&A section section?
I see one, but I think that's been answered already.
Oh, we got a new question now.
Yeah, I see the questions. So the first is on the LCOE for PV versus PV. I believe that's trying to say PV plus batteries. So that we can BNEF, we can provide that in detail for different markets. The first answer is that it's very different depending on the markets. We typically model that for utility scale projects. So we can provide that for different markets for utility scale projects. Of course, LCOEs for PV plus batteries will be slightly higher in each market than it is for PV alone. But it's important to say that you can't really compare the LCOE for PV to PV plus batteries, because PV plus batteries are a dispatchable technology which can deliver energy 24/7. Where PV alone is time limited in terms of when it can sell energy. So typically we compare the LCOEs of PV plus batteries to that for gas or for hydrogen and other dispatchable technologies. We don't do these calculations for residential storage or for residential solar and storage. Typically we calculate that with payback periods or IRRs to do that analysis, because again, residential consumers don't really use and think about the levelized cost of electricity. But if that's something that's useful, we can provide further detail on that from the BNEF side. So the second question here is what's the typical lifetime for a battery for the residential and grid scale segment? For the residential segment, typically you have companies providing warranties typically are around 10 years, depending on the technology, around 6,000 cycles. So if a consumer is doing a daily cycle, you can expect that to last maybe 15 or so years. So it depends a little bit on the technology, but the typical warranty that you see for products is 10 years. And the number of cycles usually correlates to around 15 years for the residential systems. It's pretty similar for grid scale systems. So 12-year warranties are becoming sort of more common. But depending on the technology, again, 6,000 plus cycles is possible, so around 15 years. The difference is that with the grid scale systems, there is a big opportunity to of course change cells and increase the life of the project by augmenting them.
For that same question, the typical lifespan of the residential batteries, Pylontech's typical life cycles of the residential battery is 8,000 cycles, and commercial CNI batteries is around 7,000 cycles. And that's based on our 10 years of experience. Nelson, would you like to take that question? Any chance to recycle or reuse the batteries and the cost of disposal?
Yeah. So we're at a stage, I think, with recycling. Like I said, it's a big area for us, but we're at an area where, for example, we recently closed our cost survey, and one thing we find is that a lot of manufacturers and developers, it's not something that's considered at this moment, at the beginning of the project life. It is possible to recycle and reuse these batteries. Parts of the cells, of course, will still have value, but again, it's not really included in many in the design of many projects today. So it's still evolving very quickly. Lots of the cells and storage systems that are operational today went online in the last 7 or 8 years. So we have about 5 or so more years to see how the first batch of kind of gigawatts of batteries will be recycled and reused. But the technology is there, and the potential, and of course the regulation is coming along to kind of encourage recycling.
100% agreed. With Pylontech right now, we have achieved to 100% recycle any of the waste that's produced during the manufacturing process. And since it's a new industry, we are working on reusing the used batteries, and we're waiting for that time to come. And we have published our ESG report that can be obtained on the official website. So if you're interested, feel free to download and take a look. Any other questions?
Okay, I see a question. Is there a risk of supply chain bottlenecks in the future, given the substantial growth rate we project? could this lead to cost inflation and rising prices? Yeah, that's a good question. We did go through pretty heavy, supply chain bottlenecks in 2022. And that meant we saw the first time in over a decade an increase in the average price of a battery cell or pack. And what I'll say is that those supply chain, bottlenecks were a little bit, short-lived. It's something that, of course, could reoccur depending on how the industry grows. But there was a very, very quick response from the supply side. So lots of new manufacturers of cells and systems coming along in China. Lots of investment you'll see in the US going into cell manufacturing, helped by the Inflation Reduction Act. So we're actually in a period of oversupply, where what we're seeing is, because demand was lower than expected in 2023 in markets like Italy, you're seeing that lots of companies are stuck with a lot of battery cells in inventory. Lots of Chinese manufacturers that ramped up demand, thinking, we're going to be, of course, at least in the short term, a period of aggressive growth. Some new companies are struggling. So actually in a period of oversupply. And I think, yeah, looking to the long term, I think there will be, it is, like the mining industry, there is a tendency of having a sort of a boom bust situation. But I think long term, we think supply will not be a challenge in terms of growing this market. Supply responds very quickly to changes in demand, and that's the biggest takeaway we've seen from the past year. And another sort of thing that we haven't discussed is the potential, of course, if the supply chain bottlenecks come specifically from lithium and lithium availability, there is the potential to ramp up other technologies like sodium-ion batteries. That was something that was explored and discussed very heavily last year when we were going through those bottlenecks. But it's a discussion that's come down in the last year. But there's also, of course, that potential in the long term to turn to an alternative technology. And like I showed earlier, and I didn't sort of discuss that, sodium-ion batteries are potentially attractive for residential storage systems. With the price of lithium carbonate now, LFP is the preferred technology, but that's a potential out from any supply chain bottleneck that we could face over the next few years.
All right. I think if there are no further questions, that will conclude our webcast of today. Thank you so much, Nelson, for your time and your really detailed and elaborate walkthrough of the white paper. And I'll now hand it over to Sean.
Thank you.
Right, okay. Thank you, Nelson. Thank you, Winnie. And thank you all for attending this webinar. So this is all today, and we will see you next time.
Thank you. Thank you so much.